dust, fire. The thunder of 100,000 Persian warriors screaming for Greek blood. October 1st, 331 BC. A 25-year-old Macedonian king stood outnumbered 5-1 against the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. Darius III had scythed chariots designed to shred human flesh, war elephants that could crush dozens of men with a single charge, and a battle plan so perfect that Alexander did the unthinkable. He ran. But what looked like cowardice was actually the most brilliant tactical deception in military history. A fake retreat that would destroy an empire in 90 minutes and change warfare forever. By the end of this video, you'll discover why Alexander deliberately exposed his flank to annihilation. You'll learn the forgotten Macedonian formation that turned Persian strength into fatal weakness. You'll see how one calculated diagonal charge decapitated the most powerful empire on earth. And you'll understand why military academies still study this battle 2,300 years later. But here's what makes this story truly insane. Darius had everything: superior numbers, better terrain, technological advantages Alexander couldn't match. He should have crushed the Macedonian upstart like an insect. Instead, within 90 minutes, the King of Kings was fleeing for his life while his empire burned. How did a young Macedonian turn certain death into immortal victory? The answer lies in a tactic so dangerous that one miscalculation would have meant extinction for Greece itself. To understand how Alexander won the impossible, you need to understand what he was facing, because Gaugamela wasn't just a battle, it was the Persian Empire's final answer to the Greek pest who refused to die. 2 years earlier, Alexander had humiliated Darius at Issus. The King of Kings had fled that battlefield in shame, abandoning his family, his treasure, even his royal chariot. But Issus was a narrow coastal pass where Persian numbers meant nothing. Darius had been outmaneuvered by geography. This time would be different. Darius spent 2 years preparing for this moment. He chose the battlefield personally, a massive plain near Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. Flat, open, perfect for cavalry. Then he made it even better. His engineers spent months leveling the ground, removing every rock, every bush, anything that might slow his scythed chariots. He was creating the ultimate killing floor. But wait, it gets worse for Alexander. Darius assembled an army that still gives historians chills. Conservative estimates put his force at 100,000 warriors. Some sources claim 250,000. The truth lies somewhere in between, but the exact number doesn't matter. What matters is this: Alexander had 47,000 men. The Persians outnumbered him at least 2-1, possibly 5-1. The Persian order of battle was nightmare fuel. In the center, 10,000 immortals, the elite guard who had never tasted defeat. On the flanks, 40,000 cavalry from every corner of the empire, Bactrian horsemen who could shoot arrows at full gallop, Scythian warriors who drank from the skulls of their enemies, Armenian heavy cavalry in scale armor that glittered like dragon scales, and the terror weapons. 200 scythed chariots, basically ancient tanks with 6-foot blades extending from their wheels, designed to carve through infantry like a farmer's scythe through wheat. 15 war elephants from India, creatures the Greeks had never seen in battle, each one capable of trampling entire formations into bloody mud. Darius positioned himself in the center, standing in a chariot so ornate it could be seen from a mile away. Gold, purple silk, the physical manifestation of imperial power. His message was clear. This wasn't just about defeating Alexander. This was about erasing the very idea that a Greek could challenge Persian supremacy. Alexander's army looked pathetic by comparison. 47,000 men, most of them exhausted from 3 years of constant campaigning. They had marched 2,000 miles from Macedonia. They were outnumbered, outflanked, out-equipped. Any rational commander would have negotiated. Darius had even offered Alexander half the Persian Empire, his daughter in marriage, and enough gold to make him the richest man in the Mediterranean. Alexander's response? I don't need Darius to give me what I can take. But here's where Alexander's genius reveals itself. 3 days before the battle, his scouts brought perfect intelligence. Darius had leveled the plain, removed obstacles, created the ideal cavalry battlefield. Every one of Alexander's officers saw this as a disaster. They were walking into a trap designed specifically to kill them. Alexander saw something else entirely. He saw a commander so confident in his plan that he had eliminated all variables. Darius had created a predictable battlefield. And predictability is death in warfare. The night before Gaugamela reveals why Alexander slept so peacefully while his generals panicked. Because while they saw numbers, he saw patterns. While they calculated odds, he calculated psychology. That evening, Alexander gathered his companion cavalry commanders around a fire. These were men he had grown up with. Philotas, son of Parmenion. Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. Hephaestion, his closest friend. Craterus, the most cautious of his generals. He traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. Darius thinks he's created the perfect trap. He's right, for himself. The plan Alexander outlined seemed suicidal. March diagonally away from the Persian center, expose the flank, bait the Persian cavalry into extending, then hit the gap with everything. Craterus objected immediately. If they don't take the bait, we'll be encircled and destroyed. If they take it too successfully, we'll be cut off from Parmenion and slaughtered piecemeal. The timing has to be perfect, or we all die. Alexander's response has been recorded by 3 separate historians. Then I'll make sure the timing is perfect. This is the Alexander that history forgets in favor of the myth. Not just the fearless warrior, but the meticulous planner. He had studied Darius for 3 years, watched how Persian commanders reacted under pressure, analyzed their cavalry tactics from a dozen battles. He knew Bessus, commanding the Persian left. Knew he was aggressive, glory-hungry, eager to prove himself after the shame of Issus. Knew he would pursue an exposed flank like a shark smells blood. The Macedonian formations that morning were poetry disguised as mathematics. The phalanx, 12,000 men in blocks armed with 18-foot sarissa pikes, formed the center. But Alexander had done something revolutionary. He created a second line behind the first. If the Persians broke through or encircled the flanks, the second line would simply turn 180 degrees and create a new front. A box formation that could defend in all directions. It had never been done before Gaugamela. Now it's standard infantry doctrine. On the right wing, Alexander personally commanded the companion cavalry. 2,000 elite horsemen organized into squadrons of 200. Each squadron trained to operate independently or as part of the wedge. Each man equipped with a 12-foot Existon lance, perfect for the initial charge, and a sword for close combat. But here's the detail that shows Alexander's genius. He positioned light infantry, javelin throwers, and archers in the gaps between cavalry squadrons. When the scythed chariots came, the cavalry would part, and the light infantry would destroy them. Multi-layered defense that turned the enemy's terror weapon into a liability. On the left, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek forces. His orders were simple and brutally hard. Hold. No matter what happens, no matter how many Persians attack, hold the line. Give Alexander time to work his magic in the center. Parmenion was 65 years old. He had fought under Alexander's father, Philip II. He had won battles when Alexander was still a child, and he knew his assignment at Gaugamela was a death sentence. The Persian right wing outnumbered his forces 3-1. They would hit him like a tsunami, and his job was to be the rock that broke the wave. He accepted without question, because that's what made the Macedonians unstoppable. From the king to the common soldier, everyone understood that individual survival meant nothing if the plan failed. While his generals panicked, Alexander slept. Not just slept, he slept so deeply that his officers couldn't wake him the next morning. His second-in-command, Parmenion, literally had to shake him awake hours after dawn. When asked why he slept so peacefully, Alexander smiled and said, "Because now I know where Darius is." That confidence seemed insane. As the sun rose on October 1st, the Macedonians could see what they faced. The Persian army stretched across the horizon like a bronze ocean. Their armor caught the morning sun, creating a wall of light that hurt to look at directly. The sound was apocalyptic. 100,000 men beating shields, chanting victory songs in a dozen languages, creating a wall of noise designed to break enemy morale before the first blow fell. Alexander rode down his battle line on Bucephalus, his black warhorse. The contrast was stark. Darius stood in golden splendor a mile away, surrounded by his immortals. Alexander wore the same dusty armor as his men, carried the same weapons, faced the same death. He shouted to his Macedonians, not as a king to subjects, but as one warrior to his brothers. "They have numbers, we have you." As dawn broke and the armies faced each other, one more psychological detail became clear. Alexander had positioned his army slightly to the right of the Persian center. Not a mistake, a calculated insult. He was telling Darius, "Your perfect battlefield means nothing. I'll fight where I choose." It worked. Persian officers could be seen pointing, arguing. Their perfect plans assumed Alexander would position center to center. This slight offset threw off their calculations, created doubt before the first blow fell. The psychological warfare began before a single arrow flew. Darius sent his scythed chariots forward first, 200 vehicles of death rolling across the plain, their blades spinning, creating a wall of steel designed to shred the Macedonian phalanx into meat. This is where Alexander revealed his genius. While every other army in history would have braced for impact, the Macedonians did something that seemed like madness. They opened gaps in their formation, corridors between units. As the chariots thundered forward, Macedonian trumpet signals rang out, and the infantry simply stepped aside. The chariots rolled through empty space. The few that tried to turn and attack flanks met something worse. Macedonian javelin throwers and archers who had been specifically trained for this moment. Drivers fell with arrows sprouting from their faces. Horses screamed and crashed. The terror weapon that had broken armies from Egypt to India shattered itself against Macedonian discipline. But this was just the opening move. Darius had only been testing. Now came the real assault. The Persian cavalry on both flanks charged simultaneously, 40,000 horsemen moving like twin avalanches of bronze and death. Their hooves shook the earth. Their war cries promised annihilation. The plan was simple and devastating. Crush both Macedonian flanks, encircle the center, and destroy Alexander's army in a killing pocket. Here's where Alexander made the move that still leaves military historians breathless. Instead of bracing for impact, instead of reinforcing his threatened flanks, he did the unthinkable. He ordered his entire right wing to march diagonally, away from the Persian line, exposing his flank to the enemy cavalry bearing down on him. His generals thought he'd gone mad. Parmenion sent urgent messages. "The right flank is exposed. We'll be surrounded." But Alexander kept marching, angling his force away from the Persian center, creating a gap between his army and Darius's. From the Macedonian perspective, they were walking to their deaths. Every step took them further from support. Every yard created more space for Persian cavalry to exploit. The men could see the Persian left wing, thousands of horsemen, adjusting to follow them. They were marching into a closing vice. Logic screamed to stop, to turn, to fight. But Alexander kept moving, kept angling away, kept creating tension in the Persian line. The Persians saw this and couldn't believe their luck. The fool was running. The great Alexander was exposing his army to encirclement. Bessus, commanding the Persian left wing, ordered his cavalry to pursue, to widen that gap, to get behind Alexander and slaughter him from the rear. This is the moment. This single moment where empires balanced on a knife's edge. Because Alexander wasn't retreating. He was baiting a trap. As the Persian cavalry extended to follow Alexander's diagonal movement, their formation stretched. Gaps appeared in the Persian line, small at first, then larger. The perfect cohesion Darius had spent 2 years creating began to tear like fabric under strain. Alexander saw it instantly. Years of training, dozens of battles, and pure instinct told him the exact moment. He wheeled Bucephalus toward the Persian center, raised his lance, and screamed the order that would echo through 2,300 years. "Companion cavalry, with me!" What happened next took 17 minutes and destroyed an empire. The companion cavalry wheeled from column into wedge formation in seconds. 2,000 horsemen forming a triangle with Alexander at the point. The geometry was perfect. The wedge concentrates maximum force at minimum frontage. Spreads the formation behind, so flanks can protect the penetration. The sound of 2,000 horses going from trot to gallop to full charge is something modern humans have never experienced. The ground shakes, the air vibrates. It's not just noise. It's physical pressure that you feel in your chest. The Persian infantry in front of the gap saw them coming. These weren't the elite immortals. These were levied troops from the outer provinces. Brave men, but not trained for this. They had maybe 30 seconds to prepare for impact. Some ran. Can't blame them. 2,000 Macedonian cavalry in wedge formation, led by Alexander himself, was like watching a bronze avalanche aimed at your face. Others tried to form up, leveled spears, braced for impact. It didn't matter. The wedge hit with the force of a modern artillery strike. Lances 12 feet long, held by men on horses moving 30 miles per hour, punched through bronze armor and human bodies like they were paper. The front rank of Persian infantry simply ceased to exist. But the genius of the wedge wasn't just the initial impact. As the point penetrated, the following ranks widened the breach. Like driving a wedge into wood, splitting it apart. The Macedonians drove deeper into the Persian formation with each second. Alexander's lance, according to ancient sources, broke in the body of the first man he killed. The shaft was thick oak, designed to withstand incredible force. For it to break meant Alexander hit that Persian with the combined momentum of himself, his armor, his horse, and the full speed charge. He drew his sword without breaking stride. The blade, a kopis, was designed for cavalry combat. Short, heavy, curved, made for chopping downward from horseback. It found Persian flesh and bone with mechanical regularity. The companions behind him fought with synchronized precision. They had trained together for years. Each man knew exactly where his brothers would be, what angle of attack they would use. They moved like a single organism, not 2,000 individuals. The Persian defense crumbled in layers. First, the levied infantry. Then the provincial cavalry that tried to stop the penetration. Then the officer corps, noblemen who thought their bronze armor and ancestral courage would stop the Macedonian tide. They all died. Not from superior equipment, not from better armor or weapons, from superior coordination, training, and the absolute conviction that they would win. But Alexander wasn't targeting random soldiers. His eyes were locked on one prize, the golden chariot at the center of the Persian line, Darius himself. The Macedonian wedge drove deeper into the Persian formation with Alexander at its tip. 15 minutes into the charge, they had penetrated 400 yards. They had carved a corridor of death through the greatest army on earth. The immortals finally reacted, closing ranks around their king. 10,000 of the finest warriors Persia had ever produced. Men selected from childhood for size, strength, and skill. Each one a veteran, each one sworn to die protecting the King of Kings. Alexander went through them like a farmer harvesting wheat. Eyewitness accounts become almost unbelievable here. Ptolemy, who later became Pharaoh of Egypt, was there. He described Alexander as fighting in a state of divine fury, not reckless, controlled, but utterly unstoppable. Every sword stroke killed, every movement economical and lethal. A Persian nobleman, Ariobarzanes, charged Alexander personally. This was a champion, a man who had won 100 single combats. He came at Alexander with a spear thrust aimed at the throat, a killing blow. Alexander's response was almost casual. He swatted the spear aside with his shield, guided Bucephalus with his knees to close the distance, and drove his sword through Ariobarzanes' face before the Persian could recover. The whole exchange took maybe 3 seconds. That's what separated Alexander from other warriors. Most men in combat react. They defend, counter, survive. Alexander attacked. Continuously, relentlessly, mechanically. Defense was just preparation for the next attack. The immortals, despite their training and courage, had never faced anything like this. They were bred for set-piece battles, for defending positions, for coordinated shield wall combat. But the Macedonian wedge had shattered their formation, reduced the battle to individual combats, where Macedonian training and Alexander's presence created localized superiority. One by one, the immortals fell. And as they fell, the psychological impact rippled through the Persian army. These were the elite, the unconquerable. If they could die, anyone could die. If Alexander could cut through them like they were nothing, what hope did normal soldiers have? Darius saw his guard collapsing, saw Alexander, covered in blood that wasn't his own, smiling as he killed, saw the Macedonian wedge now less than 100 yards from his chariot. And he made the calculation that destroyed his empire. My life is worth more than this battle. For the second time in his life, Darius felt something he had never known before Alexander. Fear. Pure, animal terror. This wasn't a battle. This was a young god of war come to claim what the old gods had promised him. He turned his golden chariot and fled, whipping his horses into a gallop, abandoning his army, his empire, his dignity. Everything except his life. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The immortals, seeing their god-king fleeing, broke. Persian morale, which had been rock-solid despite the penetration of their line, shattered like dropped glass. Because in the ancient world, if the king runs, the gods have already decided the battle. If you're fascinated by tactical genius and the moments that changed history forever, hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the strategies that built and destroyed empires. Ring that notification bell, because the next video reveals how Alexander's tactics at Gaugamela influenced Napoleon and why modern special forces still study this battle. But here's where it gets even more insane. While Alexander was destroying the Persian center, his left flank under Parmenion was getting massacred. The Persian right-wing cavalry, commanded by Mazaeus, had smashed into the Macedonian left with overwhelming force. 15,000 Persian cavalry against 7,000 Thessalians and Greek allies. The mathematics were brutal. Parmenion's line bent, then buckled, then started to break. Persian cavalry broke through in multiple places, heading for the Macedonian camp behind the lines. Parmenion sent desperate messages to Alexander. Immediate support needed or left-wing collapses. Urgent, desperate. The old general was watching his forces being overwhelmed and knew that if the left fell, the entire Macedonian army would be encircled and destroyed. Alexander faced an impossible choice: chase Darius and potentially end the war with a single capture, or save his own army from annihilation. Most commanders would have played it safe, consolidated, regrouped. Alexander's response shows the calculated ruthlessness of genius. He sent only a portion of his companions back. Not because he didn't care about Parmenion, but because he knew destroying Darius was more important than saving the left wing. If Parmenion died but Darius was captured, the war ended in total victory. If Parmenion survived but Darius escaped, the war continued with years more campaigning. Cold calculation, brutal mathematics. The left wing was expendable if it meant ending the Persian Empire. Fortunately for Parmenion, Alexander had planned for this exact scenario. The reserve line he had positioned, that second phalanx that everyone thought was overly cautious, now turned to face the Persian breakthrough. When Persian cavalry crashed into what they thought was the Macedonian rear, they instead hit a fresh phalanx with 18-foot pikes leveled and ready. The Persian raiders, weighed down with looted baggage, were slaughtered, and the companions that Alexander sent back hit Mazaeus's cavalry from an unexpected angle, creating chaos and terror. Without central command, without the confidence that Darius was winning, the Persian right wing lost cohesion. Individual commanders made individual decisions to preserve their forces, which is a fancy way of saying they ran. The pursuit lasted 3 hours. Alexander personally led the chase, trying to catch Darius, trying to end the war with a single capture. He covered 75 miles before exhaustion of horses and men forced him to halt. During that pursuit, something interesting happened. Persian soldiers who had been trying to kill Macedonians an hour earlier started surrendering in groups. Not just to save their lives. They knew Alexander rarely slaughtered prisoners, but because they wanted to join him. This is the detail history forgets. Alexander didn't just conquer Persia militarily, he conquered it ideologically. Persian soldiers looked at their king fleeing and looked at Alexander pursuing and made value judgments about leadership. Darius kept running, abandoning his second chariot, his armor, even his royal cloak. The King of Kings was reduced to a terrified man fleeing for his life. He would never stop running. Eventually, his own nobles would murder him, hoping to win Alexander's favor by eliminating the old king. By midday, the battle was over. An army of 100,000 had been broken by 47,000. Persian casualties are estimated at 40,000 dead. Macedonian losses? Conservative estimates put it at 500 killed and 5,000 wounded. Some sources claim as few as 100 Macedonian dead, though this is likely propaganda. But the numbers don't capture the magnitude of what had happened. Alexander hadn't just won a battle, he had decapitated an empire. The Persian Empire had existed for 220 years. It had defeated the Greeks at Marathon, it had burned Athens, it had ruled from Egypt to India, the largest empire the world had ever seen. And in 90 minutes, a 25-year-old Macedonian had ended it. The aftermath reads like a fever dream. Within days, Alexander entered Babylon without resistance. The city that had stood for 2,000 years opened its gates and welcomed him as a liberator. The treasures of the Persian Empire, accumulated over 2 centuries, fell into Macedonian hands. Susa, the administrative capital, surrendered. 50,000 talents of gold, enough wealth to fund Alexander's army for a decade, was added to his treasury. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital where Persian kings had been crowned for 200 years, was taken and eventually burned. But here's what separates Alexander from every other conqueror. He didn't just destroy Persia, he absorbed it. He wore Persian royal robes. He married Darius's daughter. He incorporated Persian soldiers into his army Persian nobles into his administration. He transformed conquest into fusion. Modern military analysts studying Gaugamela identified something that ancient historians missed. Alexander's diagonal march wasn't just about creating a gap in the Persian line. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. By appearing to retreat, Alexander triggered every instinct the Persians had. They were cavalry, bred on the open steppes. Their entire military culture was built around pursuit and encirclement. When Alexander moved diagonally away, he was dangling the thing Persian cavalry wanted most: an exposed flank, a routing enemy, an easy kill. Bessus and the Persian left wing couldn't resist. It would have been like putting meat in front of a starving dog and expecting it not to bite. They extended, they pursued, they created the gap that killed them. Alexander had weaponized the Persian army's own instincts against them. The tactical lessons of Gaugamela echo through military history. Napoleon studied it obsessively. He recognized that Alexander's diagonal march was the ancient equivalent of his own strategy of maneuver, appearing to retreat while actually positioning for a devastating counterattack. The German blitzkrieg of World War II used the same principle: concentrated force at a weak point, penetrate deep and fast, create panic in command structures. The Normandy invasion, the Gulf War, every successful modern military operation uses some variation of Alexander's Gaugamela playbook. Here's what modern militaries learn from this battle. Superior numbers mean nothing if you can't coordinate them. Technological advantages like scythed chariots and war elephants are worthless if the enemy refuses to cooperate with your plan. And the moral cohesion of a smaller, well-led force will beat the physical mass of a poorly commanded larger one every single time. The refuse flank tactic, deliberately weakening one side to strengthen another, became standard military doctrine. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe to modern warfare, commanders have used variations of Alexander's Gaugamela gambit. But there's a darker lesson here too, one that every military officer learns but rarely discusses. Alexander won because he was willing to sacrifice his left flank. While he was pursuing glory in the center, men were dying on his left. Parmenian's forces were being pushed back, surrounded, slaughtered. Alexander made the calculation that their deaths were acceptable if it meant destroying the Persian center. That's the burden of command, the willingness to spend lives like currency to purchase victory. After Gaugamela, Alexander was no longer just a king. He was a myth. A legend walking among mortals. Cities surrendered at the rumor of his approach. Armies melted away rather than face him. For the next 7 years, he conquered everything from Egypt to India, creating an empire that stretched 2 million square miles. But he never fought another battle like Gaugamela. He never again faced an enemy commander with Darius's resources. The victory was so complete, so total, that it eliminated peer competitors. Everyone else either submitted or got crushed by the empire Alexander had stolen from Darius. History pivoted on that diagonal march. If Alexander had fought conventionally, if he had braced for impact and tried to hold the line, the Persian numbers would have eventually told. His flanks would have been crushed, his center surrounded, and the Greek experiment in conquering Asia would have ended in a Persian victory. Instead, he changed warfare itself. He proved that tactics and psychology could multiply combat power beyond any mathematical calculation, that a smaller force, properly led and perfectly positioned, could destroy a larger one. 2,000 years later, military academies from West Point to Sandhurst still study Gaugamela. Staff officers plot Alexander's movements on maps, trying to understand how he saw what he saw, how he knew the Persians would react exactly as they did. How he timed the wedge charge to the precise heartbeat when maximum damage could be inflicted. The answers are maddeningly simple and impossibly complex. He knew because he understood human nature. He knew Bessus would pursue because cavalry always pursues. He knew Darius would run because Darius had run before at Issus. He knew his companions would follow him into hell because he had never asked them to go anywhere he wouldn't lead. That's the genius of Gaugamela. Not the tactics alone, but the integration of psychology, terrain, timing, and absolute faith that manifested as military perfection. In that dusty plain near modern-day Iraq, a young Macedonian proved something that empire builders have known ever since. Victory doesn't go to the biggest army. It goes to the commander who can make the enemy defeat themselves. Alexander didn't beat Darius. He made Darius beat Darius. The diagonal march, the exposed flank, the apparent retreat, all of it was designed to trigger Persian instincts and Persian greed, to make them extend when they should have consolidated, to make them pursue when they should have held position. And when they committed, when they had fully bought into the illusion that Alexander was beaten, he turned and drove a spear through the heart of their empire. That's why Gaugamela matters 2,300 years later. Not because of the specific tactics, cavalry wedges and refuse flanks are obsolete in modern warfare, but because of the eternal principle Alexander demonstrated: shape the enemy's perception, and you shape the battle itself. The King of Kings assembled the greatest army in human history. He chose the perfect battlefield. He had every advantage that mathematics and material could provide. And he lost to a 25-year-old who understood that wars are won in the mind before they're ever fought on the ground. When Alexander finally died in Babylon 8 years later, at age 32, he controlled everything from Greece to India. The empire he built fell apart immediately because no one else had his vision. But the legend never died. Because at Gaugamela, on October 1st, 331 BC, in front of 150,000 witnesses, Alexander proved that one man with absolute conviction could change the world. He ran from 100,000 men. Then he destroyed them all. And in doing so, he wrote the textbook on tactical genius that commanders still study when they need to beat impossible odds. That's not just history. That's the moment when the unstoppable force of Persian imperial might met the immovable object of Macedonian will. And will won. The age of Persian dominance ended not with a whimper, but with the thunder of companion cavalry and the terror of a king running for his life. They came as the rulers of half the world. They left as a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake numbers for strength and assume your enemy will fight by your rules. Alexander didn't just win the Battle of Gaugamela. He ended the ancient world and began the age that would bear his name. The Hellenistic period, 300 years of Greek culture dominating from Egypt to Afghanistan, started with one diagonal march and one perfectly timed charge. Not bad for a kid from Macedonia who everyone said was too young, too reckless, too ambitious. He showed them all what genius looks like when it refuses to accept mathematical limitations.